When Olivia and Darren Kessler purchased the Spanish-style home in the Pacific Palisades, they weren't buying a house. They were buying Hollywood history. The red-tile-roofed estate once belonged to Jack Lemmon, screen legend, Oscar winner, and one of the last great gentlemen of the Golden Age. Olivia, a television editor, had always been drawn to old homes with a story. Darren, a commercial real estate broker, had his reservations. But the moment their agent mentioned Jack Lemmon's name, she was sold. They bought the house in February, after it had sat unsold for nearly 8 months. The price had dropped twice. "People want new, not soul," Olivia said as she ran her fingers along the curved staircase's iron rail. The original owner had died in 2001, but his estate had held on to the property for years, renting it out on and off until finally listing it discreetly through a private agent. The house had charm, certainly. Arched doorways, hand-carved ceiling beams, a sunken living room that smelled faintly of tobacco, despite decades of renovations. Darren figured it was all part of the appeal. Olivia, on the other hand, felt a strange comfort in the place, like stepping into a memory that wasn't hers. The first few nights were quiet until they weren't. Started small, inconsequential even. A cabinet door left open in the morning. The grandfather clock in the hall ticking erratically, then stopping altogether. Olivia assumed it was just the quirks of an old house settling into new lives. But one night, Darren woke to the sound of a piano. The only problem, they didn't own one. He got up, walked down the dark hallway toward the living room, expecting maybe a neighbor's sound bleeding through the walls. But when he stepped into the room, the air changed. Heavy, cold, the kind of chill that didn't belong in California. The music had stopped. He turned on the lights. Nothing was there, but he noticed something odd. The hardwood floor near the fireplace bore long, faint scratch marks curved, like something heavy had been dragged. Piano? He didn't tell Olivia, but the next night, she brought it up herself. "Did this house ever have a piano?" she asked. "What?" "In the corner of the living room. I keep seeing it. Not in real life, but in my head. A big black grand. Every time I walk in, I expect it to be there." Darren said nothing. They slept poorly after that. Olivia, curious, began researching the house and Lemmon himself. She found interviews, home photos, and one rare article from a 1980s architectural magazine that included pictures of the exact living room complete with a Steinway baby grand near the fireplace. Just where she'd imagined it. Jack Lemmon had practiced every morning, she read. A jazz enthusiast. A perfectionist. Then she found something strange. In an old message board archive, buried under a thread titled Hollywood Ghosts That Might Be Real, there was a comment from a woman who claimed to have stayed in the house as a guest in the early 2000s. She mentioned hearing music at night, smelling cigar smoke, and seeing, briefly, the back of a man in a robe walking down the hallway. The post ended with one sentence. "It wasn't threatening, but it didn't feel like it knew I wasn't supposed to be there." By April, Olivia stopped sleeping altogether. She began to leave the bedroom in the middle of the night and go down to the living room just to sit. She said it made her feel like she wasn't alone, but in a comforting way. Darren disagreed. He heard her talking sometimes, not whispering, conversing, at 2 or 3 a.m. She claimed she was just thinking aloud. But one night he walked in on her. She was sitting on the floor, legs folded beneath her, looking toward the empty fireplace. "Olivia?" he asked. She turned to him, startled, not frightened, like she had forgotten he was supposed to be there. "Was he nice?" Darren asked gently. She nodded. "He's lonely." They decided to spend a weekend away. A break, they said. But when they returned, something in the house felt different, like it had noticed their absence. Pictures were off-center. The guest room door was shut, locked from the inside. Neither of them remembered closing it. Darren had a locksmith open the door. Inside it was empty, except for the faint sound of music. Again. Only this time, Darren wasn't the only one who heard it. They moved out that summer. No dramatic event pushed them out, no blood, no demonic screams, no threats. Just the slow realization that the house no longer belonged to them. Maybe it never had. Olivia cried when they left. Darren didn't look back. The couple who bought it afterward, a young music producer and his wife, renovated aggressively. Tore out the ceiling beams. Repainted the living room bright white. Removed the fireplace entirely. But neighbors say the new owners rarely stay the night. And sometimes, if you walk past the house around 3 a.m., you might hear a piano playing from inside. Not a recording. Not a smart speaker. A real piano. Soft. Jazz. Melancholy. Almost like someone is still practicing. Just trying to get it right. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house stood quiet for nearly 3 months after the Kesslers' departure. Realtors in the neighborhood noticed. The Palisades rarely had turnover like this, especially not with a property of such pedigree. But people talked. Quietly. Unofficially. No one wanted to scare away prospective buyers, but the word weird had been murmured more than once. Then came the Edgertons. Blake Edgerton was a Grammy-nominated sound engineer. Mid-30s, confident, restless, and newly rich from producing a string of platinum indie pop records. His wife, Marissa, had that quiet elegance found in people who never had to try too hard. She ran a boutique modeling agency out of West Hollywood, though her true passion was restoring old properties with bones. They didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in design, feng shui, minimalism, artful reinvention. By the second week, they had already gutted the kitchen, torn down the arch between the dining room and den, and replaced the terracotta flooring in the entry hall with polished concrete. The house was a project, a jewel to be polished until it gleamed like an Apple store. They slept in a temporary bedroom while the real master suite was being refitted with smart lighting and blackout shades. Blake installed a home studio in the garage, outfitted with tube amps, vintage Newman mics, and floor-to-ceiling acoustic foam. At night, when the contractors left and the dust settled, the two of them would pour wine and sit on their barely unpacked sofa, listening to the low hum of the canyon beyond the glass. It was on one such night late June, soft marine layer blanketing the coast, that Marissa heard the sound. A distant plink, like a single key being struck on a piano. Muted, low, almost apologetic. She turned her head sharply toward the back of the house. Blake was talking mid-sentence about how the west wall might be perfect for an Alexander Calder print. He didn't notice the shift in her attention. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" "A note. From the back." He smiled faintly, assuming she meant construction sounds or maybe the wind. But Marissa didn't smile. She rose, glass still in hand, and walked barefoot down the hallway toward the rear corridor, where the original den once stood. The sound came again. A half chord this time. Fewer notes than a chord, more than one. And off, just a little flat. She stopped, listening hard, heart quietly racing, though she didn't understand why. The hallway was dark, the overheads removed during renovation, and in that absence of light, the house felt older. More rooted, like it had drawn a long breath while no one was watching. She called out, "Hello." Nothing. Then the softest trace of smoke. Not burning, not fire. Something gentler. A cigar, maybe, long since extinguished but leaving behind its memory. She reached for the wall to steady herself, fingers brushing old plaster that hadn't yet been redone. It was warm. That night, Marissa said nothing to Blake. She chalked it up to exhaustion, nerves, the scent of something in the vent system. But the next day, as she returned from the studio tour in Silver Lake, she paused outside the house, staring at it for a long moment before entering. Not fear, but a weight, like someone watching her from the inside, already expecting her to be late. Blake had dreams. He didn't mention them at first, just flashes of odd things upon waking. A mirror cracking silently. A heavy bench being pushed across a hardwood floor. Curtains fluttering even when the windows were shut. Nothing concrete. Nothing frightening. But always the same man. He couldn't see him clearly, just a vague impression of a tall figure in a bathrobe, standing near the edge of a stage. Sometimes he held a glass. Sometimes a script. Once, Blake swore he saw a music sheet in the man's hand, though he couldn't read the notes. What struck him most was not the image, but the mood. It was sadness. A deep, marrow-level sadness. Not grief, not horror, just the bone-deep ache of someone who could not leave because he didn't know where to go. Blake began working later and later in the garage studio. The soundproofed walls felt safer somehow. Marissa noticed the change in him, subtle but growing. He flinched at small sounds. He jumped when the doorbell rang. Once, when she brushed past him in the hallway, he recoiled as though touched by ice. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, trying to laugh. He didn't answer. That night, she found a chair had been moved. The high-backed velvet accent chair, one they had pulled in temporarily from the guest room, was now positioned directly in front of the empty fireplace. As if someone had been sitting there for hours, staring into something that wasn't burning. She asked Blake about it. He hadn't touched it. Neither had she. The third week of July opened with a heat wave, one of those suffocating Southern California spells where the sky turns metallic and the breeze carries the smell of dry concrete. The Palisades felt more claustrophobic than usual, wrapped in stillness. The ocean air held hostage by an invisible hand. Inside the house, the newly installed smart thermostat blinked in confusion. It refused to hold a setting, jumping erratically between readings, ignoring Blake's commands. 1 minute the air was frigid, then thick and unmoving. He blamed the electricians, but Marissa suspected something else, though she wasn't yet ready to say it aloud. The walls had begun to creak slow, drawn-out groans that didn't follow the usual rhythm of an old home expanding under the sun. These were irregular, almost hesitant, as if the house was listening to itself. At first it was just at night, but then, during the day, Marissa started hearing it too. Especially when she stood in the doorway of what had once been the den, the room that, according to old photos, once held Lemmon's piano. By then, the fireplace had been removed. The entire wall behind it had been knocked down, replaced with a smooth expanse of drywall and a recessed mount for a flat-screen TV. The corner where the piano once stood was now empty, but the air there still felt different, heavier, denser, as if the past still occupied space even after you erased its physical markers. One afternoon, when the contractors were gone, Marissa stood in that room alone and felt something she couldn't describe, not a presence. Exactly, but a resistance. Like walking through water instead of air. Her phone refused to take pictures in that part of the house. Every attempt came out overexposed, blown out with light that wasn't there. Blake became obsessed with the lighting. He ordered new bulbs, Edison-style filaments, warm glow LEDs, vintage sconces that matched the architecture. Nothing stayed consistent. One would flicker, another would grow inexplicably dim, then surge too bright. Several fixtures shorted out. The electrician, a man named Marco with 20 years of experience, finally shrugged and said, "Old houses do what they want." But this house wasn't just old, it was deliberate. One night, Blake walked into the living room to find every lamp on. They hadn't been before. The master switch hadn't been touched. The wall controls had been reset. He stared at the glow for a long time, not moving, as though trying to determine whether the light was an invitation or a warning. Later that same week, Marissa opened the hallway linen closet to find the same velvet accent chair, the one that had mysteriously repositioned itself in front of the fireplace, now tucked tightly inside the narrow space. The chair was too large to fit easily. It had to have been shoved in there on a diagonal, then turned. She called out to Blake, who swore he hadn't touched it. "How could you even get it in there?" she asked. He didn't respond. He just stared at it like he was waiting for it to move again on its own. On July 29th, Blake stopped sleeping in the bedroom. He moved into the garage studio under the pretense of needing space for his work. He started composing again, but not music. He was recording something. Sounds. Ambient noise. The hum of the room. Whispers from corners. Long, low rumbles that didn't have a source. Marissa walked in on him late one night, no lights, just the soft glow of a laptop screen. He was sitting motionless, headphones on, staring at the waveforms on the monitor as though they were speaking to him. When she asked what he was listening to, he jumped and yanked off the headphones. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "It's nothing." Room tone. But she saw his hand trembling. And the audio file name at the top of the screen. Lemon _take5.wave. She didn't ask. 2 days later, Blake began locking the studio door. Marissa felt the shift between them. Not just the silence, but the way he'd begun to study the house, as though trying to memorize something he couldn't explain. He would walk into a room and stand there for several minutes, saying nothing, occasionally nodding as if in agreement with a voice only he could hear. At dinner, he barely spoke. And when she asked if he was feeling okay, he only answered once, softly. He's not angry. He just wants it back the way it was. She didn't ask who he was. She already knew. By mid-August, the renovation was nearly complete. The house looked immaculate on the outside, sand-colored stucco gleaming beneath a soft ocean haze. Windows polished, front steps swept daily. It was the kind of home people took photos of as they passed, whispering guesses about the famous person who might live there. But inside, it had become something else entirely. Marissa stopped inviting people over. She no longer felt safe offering explanations for the little things: light switches that clicked on without a finger, faucets that trickled when no one turned them, the cold that lingered only in the northwest corner of the living room, no matter how hot it got outside. She slept with her phone under her pillow, flashlight app ready, and only ever used the ensuite bathroom, now never the main one down the hall, not since the mirror above its sink began showing two reflections. Blake had changed entirely. His studio had grown dark and humid, the windows covered with blankets from inside. Marissa could hear the recordings through the walls: looped audio, hissed consonants, pauses that felt loaded with intention. At night, the whispering came through the vents. Not words exactly. Breaths, vocal fragments, syllables rearranged by something too old to speak cleanly. She broke into the studio one afternoon while Blake was asleep on the chaise in the backyard. His laptop was on. The waveform from the night before sat open on the screen, its peaks jagged and irregular. She pressed play. First just room tone, then a subtle creak, like weight shifting on a wooden bench. A pause. And then, as clearly as if someone had leaned in beside her, "You don't understand. I never left." Marissa reeled back, yanking the headphones off. Her hand trembled. She stepped away from the computer, her eyes scanning the walls, the dim overhead bulb, the racks of unused gear. There was no one else there, but the room felt full. That night, she demanded answers. Blake didn't fight her. He only nodded and said, he was rehearsing, still is. And then he told her everything. Jack Lemmon had lived in the house longer than most knew. Not just as a celebrity stopping through the Palisades, but as an artist who kept working even after the scripts stopped coming. In his final years, he'd converted the den into a kind of hybrid studio, part music room, part stage. He installed soundproofing, had a private line run to an engineer friend in Beverly Hills. He recorded monologues, piano improvisations, bits of song and memory, dozens of tapes most never released. When he became ill, he stopped labeling them, just stored them away, box after box in the attic and crawl space. Blake had found them during week 1. The first tape was labeled Rehearsal Scene 2, Bad Light. He played it. Lemmon's voice, clear and alive. Lines repeated, paused, sung under his breath. A low chuckle, then a silence so long it felt like a scene unto itself. Blake had felt something shift in the house that day. Not darkness, not evil, just gravity, like something old and unfinished had been stirred. So he listened to another, then another. By the time Marissa had started to worry, he was already building a soundbed beneath Lemmon's voice. A score, an atmosphere, something to accompany what he believed to be the actor's final, never-produced work. But Blake didn't stop there. He began speaking back to the tapes, reading scene directions aloud, leaving pauses where Jack might reply, adding cues as if he were directing a living actor instead of a ghost. Marissa realized with mounting dread that he no longer saw this as haunting. To him, it had become a collaboration. That night, she tried to convince him to leave, to walk away from the house, the tapes, the project. But he only smiled and said, "It's not done." I promised him we'd finish. She didn't know who he meant by we. 3 days later, she came home from a late meeting and found the house dark. Not just unlit silent. Still. The kind of stillness that suggests something important has already happened. Blake wasn't in the studio. He wasn't in the bedroom or kitchen or yard. Then she saw the door to the old den open. She stepped inside and froze. The room looked different. Gone was the new drywall, the mounted TV. Even the lighting had shifted. In its place stood Jack Lemmon's original baby grand piano, right where it had sat in the 1980s. The wallpaper was different, yellowed and soft. A framed photo sat on a small table near the window. Black and white. Blake and Jack, seated side by side, though the photo had never been taken. She tried to speak, but the words stayed stuck in her throat. From behind the piano, a sound rose. A single note. Then another. A slow, uneven melody. The shape of something unfinished. She moved closer, and as she rounded the edge of the room, she saw Blake seated at the bench, eyes half closed, hands poised just above the keys but not touching. The sound was still coming. But Blake's hands weren't moving. He whispered. He said it's his last take. Just one more. Then he'll rest. Tears lined his cheeks, but his voice was steady, calm. Then, behind the far wall, the recessed lights blinked once and dimmed. The air thickened. The room seemed to bend at the edges. And for a fraction of a second, no more Marissa saw a shape in the reflection of the black piano lid. Not a monster. Not a corpse. Just a man in a bathrobe, holding a script, looking directly at her with infinite sadness and the faint trace of a smile. And then he was gone. Marissa sold the house 6 months later. Blake never came with her. He stayed. Not as a prisoner but as a partner. Still working. Still composing. Occasionally speaking in low tones to someone no longer seen. She visited once, years later, out of curiosity. The house had changed again. Empty, but not abandoned. And in the back room, the one that had been the den, she could still hear it. A faint melody. Always drifting. Never finishing. A scene still in rehearsal. A man who had never truly taken his final bow. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.